It's a great honor. Today we are with Professor Haken, and he created one of the most miraculous music instruments in history. Lot of music instruments we see are made out of two-dimensional arrays, two-dimensional thinking, without the ability of the musician creating a depth that creates different magical experience. Thank you, Professor, for giving us the time.
Oh, excellent. Thank you for being here.
Thank you. So, what inspired you to create this amazing Continuum?
Well, actually, I've been working on it for a very long time. People always think, wow, how did you do this? But persistence. I've been working on it since about the 1980s or so, middle 1980s. And at that time already, there were keyboards. There weren't MIDI keyboards yet, but there were keyboards, and there were also ribbon controllers. But there was very little in electronics. Having grown up with playing violin, there really was very little continuous pitch things, especially ones that were accurate in pitch. So I wanted to make an instrument that was like a violin, where you could play vibrato like a violin, because that's what I was familiar with. I wanted to make something that could do that. And so very early on, the very first thing I knew is on a violin, actually, it's surprising, and I think this is true in many acoustic instruments. When you place your finger on a violin, you're placing your finger accurate to about 10 microns, which is, so that's 10 millionths of a meter. Now, you have a big fat finger, obviously you can't just place it and have it be right, but when you play intervals, when you play double stops on a violin, and or say when you're tuning your strings or anything like that, when you're listening for those beats to melt away, say you're playing a fifth with fingers on the strings, when you roll your fingers to make the beats melt away, that's super, super accurate. So I knew already from the very beginning, whatever it is, it has to be accurate, incredibly accurate to where the center of your finger is. And well, I started in the 1980s, and since then I've still been working on it. But that's the inspiration, it really came from the violin.
Professor, I have a question. Really, we are thinking what it takes to create Continuum, because human beings, as we generally think, right brain and left brain, you seem to have both, like integrating these two worlds together, the mathematics and engineering on one side and the art on the other side. What are your thoughts on this process?
Well, one thing is I'm very thankful to my mom, who unfortunately has passed away now, but she forced me to play violin every day. I never liked it, and I was never very good at it. I had to play violin every day, practice for an hour, get up at 6 and practice with the rest of our kids. Like I say, I was never so good. I come from a very musical family. My siblings are good, and I could tell I wasn't, but I still played enough that I understood what I didn't know. And so being an engineer is great, because I can work with, well, now I can work with fantastic world-class artists, and I can be a part of it, even though actually my musical skills, I'm a B- musician, but I played in enough orchestras and pit orchestras for operas and that sort of thing that I became quite familiar with all the different sounds of the orchestra and learned what I liked about it. And so that was an enormously important experience. And I think now one of the things that happens is many of my students never played an acoustic instrument. They've only played synthesizers. And it's strange. They've never experienced what it is to have that continuous real interaction with the sound, both the frustrations and the good parts. And so I think it's an interesting time, and I'm very happy that now there's been much growing interest in the Continuum. We also made a less expensive Continuum Mini, which in some sense maybe isn't as good. It has 4 sensors instead of hundreds, but at the same time, the acoustic world is like that too. There's many beautiful instruments that are quite simple. Even a tin whistle or something can be quite a beautiful instrument in the right hands. And so in this sense, it does have the same thing as a Continuum, in the sense that it's very accurate, follows very closely what your fingers are doing. It doesn't play many notes at once. It has many things it doesn't do, but it's still, I think, a good instrument, and good enough that people are interested. You know, the general interest has just grown a lot.
Professor, I have a wonderful experience of seeing it played by legends like A.R. Rahman, who's like a Grammy Award winner.
Oh, yes, yes. Yeah, he's a fantastic man. And in fact, it's just working with him was so amazing that it sometimes makes me a little embarrassed that you know, I'm not all famous people are so good to be around. You know, some of them are very arrogant, some of them are very difficult, and he's not at all like that. And it's just, I think it's an incredible credit, well, not just to himself, but to India, just to have an emissary like that, where he is really a very likable and very nice person. I do have a funny story about him, just because, you know, he's so he's so loved and so intelligent and so skilled that funny things happen when you get to that level. One of the first times I was with him in Hollywood, he was setting up a studio there, and where Hans Zimmer has a bunch of studios. He was setting up his studio there, and we were working, I can't even remember on what, but it made an impression on me, because after several days of working with him, he turned to me and said, "Wow, you actually listen to what I say." And I was amazed, like, what in the world? You know, what does he even mean by this? But I realized, well, you know, I'm an engineer, and sometimes, you know, he's actually quite a skilled engineer himself, but so, you know, if he says something that I don't think makes sense, I say, oh, well, no, that doesn't work because this or that. And anybody with more social skills than me, of course, would just assume, well, either he didn't mean what he said, or he meant something different, or I didn't understand it or something. So it was kind of funny because, but he's somebody that, yeah, you can treat as, you know, he treats me as an equal, which is certainly not what you come to expect if you go to Hollywood. So it's very, very nice.
That's great, Professor.
Very impressive man.
Very. Professor, you mentioned about sensors. So now we are talking, because of Continuum, we are talking about a different world altogether. Human finger movement is creating amazing music. So how these sensors work for a layman to understand?
Oh, okay. I guess, yeah, I don't have one taken apart right now, but on the Continuum, on the very top layer, is some neoprene. In fact, I could, well, here, actually, that's the Continuum Mini. That's actually kind of cute to show. It's a much simpler device. This is number 0. I've been working. It's one I use for work and development, so it has holes in the back. But ignoring that, it's, yes, it's a simpler device. It just has one big plate under it. The Continuums themselves have neoprene on the top, which is, this is an older version of the neoprene. It doesn't have as clear lines, but it's just rubber, like wetsuit rubber. And then underneath that are a whole bunch of precision machined rods. They have magnets crimped in the end. And then when you press on the rubber compresses some, like, it's like a sponge. So if you press harder, it gets harder to compress the rubber. And that actually feels good. That's what people sort of expect. So the rubber is mostly there just to feel good. It's also there because I wanted to make sure that if you play like with your pinky, or if you play with your thumb, you know, a thin bony finger or a fatter finger, that you could play the same sorts of things with either finger. So it turns out that the neoprene is useful for that because it's very, very uniform. When you press on the neoprene, it presses down on these rods, which are suspended by piano wire springs. So there's a whole bunch of rods and springs under them. Should I go ahead and get one?
Please.
I have one over there. I have to... do I just carry this with me?
Yeah, yes, sir.
Okay. You're going to edit it later, right?
Absolutely.
So, okay,
Let's
here,
do that.
I'll just... Because I think I have a... Yes, I have one here.
It's going great. The reason I came is then he can look at me and then...
మరి ఇంకా అట్లా చూస్తే ఇంటర్వ్యూషన్ మరి అట్లా ఉంది.
Okay, sure. నేను ఇక్కడ కూర్చుంటాను కానీ he can look towards camera nearly. Yeah. For the field of view, I moved here so that you're looking at just one direction, more easier
okay.
for you. Yeah.
Okay, and I hope I didn't mess this up.
No,
Just
it's really
one
good.
more here. Okay, I think I have all my show and tell.
Wow.
Okay, so what is this still running?
Perfect.
This is still recording
Yeah,
correctly. Is that-
perfect.
Okay, good.
It's, the light is on. You can put it actually in your pocket or something.
Okay,
Just put it
I'll
in
just
there,
do that.
light it, yeah.
I'm an engineer. I have
Perfect.
junk in my pocket. Yeah. So this is one taken apart. If you own one of these, I would suggest talk to us before you take it apart. There are hundreds of springs in there, but you don't want them to fall out, or it'll be very many hours of work. But in any case, so what's underneath the neoprene is what you see, and when you press on a continuum, you really don't feel these rods, but when that's opened up, well, that's what they look like. There's a bunch of these precision machined rods, and when you press on the neoprene, your fingers, as you rotate them, your finger position is much more accurate than the sensor spacing, because it makes a parabola through the neighboring rods. So it actually uses 12 rods when it's tracking each finger. The neoprene spreads out your finger pressure, and then you get a very nice shape in these rods. When the magnets move down, magnetic sensors pick that up. And like I say, it's accurate to almost 3 orders of magnitude narrower than a rod. So it's very much more accurate than the rods you're seeing, and that way you get just tiny variations. If you do the smallest variation, you really affect the sound with that. So that's all the sensing. I can show also, these rods, by the way, when you look at them here, when it's not assembled, they aren't even all straight. Once they're actually squeezed together under the neoprene, everything is very precise, yes. And it's a little bit like an acoustic instrument. There's some calibration, you do it first, but then, yeah, it's very precise. What's underneath there is just these boards, which look quite simple, other than being carefully designed for no ground noise and such. They have all of these Hall effect sensors along the sides, and then multiplexers and A to D converters. So these are, this is sort of straightforward what's in there, but each of these sensors is pretty expensive, and there are many of them, on each board. And well, this is a half size, so there's 2 of these boards in there. Full size has 4 boards. So it's sort of an expensive thing, but it's very fast. It scans, it responds to what you do with your fingers within 1/3 of a millisecond. So it's faster. A lot of times it's easy to think, oh well, you need to have nanosecond accuracy, and actually with your fingers you don't have that. And even when you hear say somebody's playing on the beat or not on the beat, that's not at all to that kind of accuracy. But we need that kind of accuracy for other reasons. One of them is that you do actually sometimes hear to about a millisecond. You can hear things, and so it's nicer to have headroom. It's nicer to be faster than that. As you're moving your fingers or as you're doing things, I also need it to be fast, because this is only half of it. Is what is, can you sense the finger position super accurately? Then the next half of it is, well, what do you do with that information? And it turns out synthesizers have gotten excellent and really good and really useful at MIDI keyboards, at a keyboard where you just start and stop things. And there's a lot of useful things to do with that. And even in the acoustic world, if you think, a MIDI keyboard has less interaction with sound than a piano, but still, piano is a keyboard, and you think of a piano compared to, say, violin. That's my instrument, so it's safe for me to talk about it. Well, in a piano you can play 12-note chords, and it's commonly done. On the very most you can do on a violin is 4 notes, sort of, maybe 3 notes really at one time. So it's not, a very big difference there. On a piano, because you hit the right lever and you don't have to worry about tuning throughout the note, you can play very quickly. You can play many notes quickly and accurately, a whole wash of sounds, of notes, where in a violin it's much less so. Violin is much more of a melody instrument with some chord abilities, and so they're different. And is a violin better than a piano or worse? I don't know. They're different things. They're both good. So it's a silly question to ask which is better. What is strange in the synthesizer world is that keyboards is almost everything. There's almost nothing besides keyboards, and so that's strange. That's as if in the acoustic world you got rid of all the orchestra instruments and only had keyboard instruments. And you got rid of all of the, many traditional Indian instruments, some fretted, some not, but they're still not like keyboards. Even on a fretted instrument, you have much more pitch control and much more detail control than you do on a piano. The detail control is good in a way because you can really express yourself, and it's sort of bad in a way because if you want to play lots of notes quickly, you can't really do that. The piano is the right instrument for that. So it's just a different thing. So in now, when we talk about Carnatic music or such, well, there it's a really big problem with synthesizers because so much is swept under the carpet. Then so much of this musical tradition is gone, and really in what's commonly called Western music, correctly or not. But if you ignore the term for and then just the meaning, it was really only the last 100 years that in most Western music, people sort of given up on exact tuning. It's and gone with the equal tempered scale. When Bach, way back in his day, did the equal tempered clavier, it was just sort of an interesting experiment. It wasn't meant to take over. So even but in India, well, fortunately that hasn't happened yet. There's still a lot of interest in something besides just the equal tempered scale. So I think it's a good time to be doing this. I think it's a useful thing. But so then what happens though on a keyboard? You're starting and stopping things, and the wonderful thing about synthesizer keyboards is that there's a lot of fine structure and sounds and stuff, and all of that is automated for you if you have a MIDI keyboard. And that automation can be extremely useful. It's not just bad, but there's many times when you don't want to have it automated, and people don't even know that anymore. Or when I say people, maybe Indian audience is different, but in the US, I think people don't even know what they're missing. They're just totally unaware that something is different. If they have good samples of violin, they figure, well, they don't need violin players. And they just don't realize that this is only one aspect of an instrument. And yes, your violin samples may be very good. And even if you have a simulated violin, like if it's not sampled, if it's physical models, still, even if those are very good, you're missing the core part of it, which is a human interaction with the instrument, if you don't have continuous pitches. On this instrument, I should say, just to make it clear, this is not a violin. And yes, you can play violin-like sounds better on it than you could on any other synthesizer. But in the end, if you want a violin, get a violinist. There's really good violinists out there, and there's no substitute for pulling a bow over a string. There's no substitute for that particular interaction with an instrument. So in no way do I say, oh, this just replaces all those instruments. Not at all. This is just another one like it. And in the electronic world, well, there's very few. This is certainly the most accurate and the fastest of all of those. So once you have this, though, well, so what does happen in a violin? For instance, on a synthesizer, if you play a vibrato, well, it's all automated. And on a violin, when you move your finger, it's actually quite complicated what happens because you have the bonier part of your finger hit the string, and then you have a flabbier part of the finger. So it's not just a pitch change. It's a much more complicated thing than that. The timbre is really changing, and how do you capture any of that kind of stuff, which in every last acoustic instrument you want to speak of, all of those have that interest to them. And that's a hard thing. So we have an Egan matrix synthesizer where we try to do that, and to say it in a short way, the idea is that your finger pressure and your front-back position, and your right-to-left position is used to affect many different parameters in the sound. It's not just that right-to-left is only pitch, but it affects many other things about the sound, as does the pressure. And in that way, hopefully, we can get some of the interest, anyway, that you have in acoustic instruments. So,
Professor, actually, your instrument comes at a very relevant time of the world. We are seeing a lot of digital revolution in the music world, including an iPad, people starting to geosynth and all that. And there are keyboards, and people are becoming aware, and the boxes and the blocks,
right.
Music blocks are coming. Right. What an amazing time. You had this vision more than 20 years ago. You already saw that.
Yeah, and I think there is a problem for a lot of the new instruments. At the surface, when you first look at them, it seems sort of similar, but I think one of the things that happens from economic necessity is people that already have synthesizers want to be able to use all those synthesizers, whatever new thing they get. So like if you get a C board or something, it works very well with the things you already have. But then necessarily the things you already have, all the fine structure is automated. So the problem there is it's sort of difficult, I think, for a company that has to make profit. It's a very hard thing to break into because you don't want to tell people, well, yeah, you can control synthesizers you have, but it's really not worth it. I can do that, but for a company that wants to sell to a big audience, I think that's a difficult thing. So I think one of the things that is an impediment now is that keyboards have been so successful and they've done so well at it that it's really hard to break out of that mold, because fundamentally what a synthesizer does that's automating the fine structure is quite different and unrelated to what it does, or what a synthesizer does, where you're, in the feedback, as an engineer would say, the feedback loop, the timbre feedback. To a musician, unfortunately, feedback means something different. Timbre control loop, I should say. Where you're really listening and constantly adjusting like you do in an acoustic instrument. That's a really, really different kind of synthesis. And I think actually people are not aware how little they know about that kind of synthesis. I think what we have is probably the best there is now, this Egan matrix, and it's also, it's just beginning the things you would like to do. So it is a real, I think that there's this realization that people haven't had yet, which is, if you really want to control the fine structure, it can't be built into your sound. If you really want to control the fine structure, you need every particular preset you load up. You really need to learn to play that. Like I always tell people, well, world-class flute player, and you just tell people, oh, well, in 2 weeks I want to play trumpet with the orchestra. If you've never played trumpet before, people laugh. But on a synthesizer, you just press the trumpet button, and there you go. So it's really different. And in fact, the skills for playing trumpet are so different that even if you're a great flute player, it gives you a head start, but it doesn't mean you'll be a great trumpet player ever. And if you practice all your life at trumpet and do get to be a world-famous trumpet player, you've ruined your lips. You can't play flute anymore. So, it's just a very different world. There's a lot more buy-in. There's not this idea of one size fits all. There's not this idea. And so I think that whole thing is people have to rediscover that it actually really experimenting and with something like the Continuum, some people buy it and it's expensive and they expect to sound great right away. And actually, if you buy an expensive violin, do you expect to be a great violinist? It doesn't really make sense. And so I think there is this whole aspect of it that people don't realize that is really part of it and an integral part of it.
Professor, how many instruments we can play right now with Continuum?
Well, you can play a lot of different sounds. I would say, though, like I was saying before, the new firmware will have around 500 or so, but many of those are actually quite odd to play, or not the sort of things that you would normally do. And it really isn't, it hasn't been our goal, and I think we also couldn't do it, which is, to try to replace acoustic instruments. It really doesn't work that well because, well, if you want to, say, play a flute, it's just a very different experience. Part of the integral part of it is how you interact with the instrument, and also the limitations of what you can do, and even simple things like the limitations of how in tune you can play. One of the reasons this thing sounds so much better at violin than keyboards is just that, well, many of the notes aren't quite in tune. You're always striving for perfection, but if you actually get there and everything is equal tempered, then it's no longer interesting. Or even if everything is some just tuning exactly. And if a violinist plays, or even a good singer, or any of these instruments that are continuous pitch, you're always listening to what's going on, and you always do a little bit of adjustment for the notes right then. And a C in one part of your, in the same piece might be different than the C in another, and that's not what's important. What's important is how does it sound with everything else. And so it's a really, it's a different, a different thing. And for me, since I have the privilege of teaching here at the university, it's been nice because I can, I have an income. My family is supported from teaching at the university, so I can do things that take 10 or 20 years, and I can not make a profit at it for a very long time. And even now, this is quite an expensive thing to build, and a mechanical design like this is expensive, and I have the privilege of building the best I can, and it is a little bit problematic. Lots of people can't afford it, and that's true. I have somebody once wrote me and said, "Yeah, I bought this instead of a new car, but it's a lot more fun than a car, so it was worth it." So there you go.
Professor, it is very humbling. You're teaching at a university, you have invented this, and how do you maintain this humbleness? What makes you so simple?
Well, actually, it's funny because, I'm surrounded by brilliant people, and it always seems that way from the outside. I've been doing the same thing for so many years, and it seems obvious after some time, where I'm surrounded by other people at the university that are brilliant at whatever their field is. So yes, it's actually that feeling never goes away, really, and it's a joy. I think one of the things for me is that it was useful that I played music and still occasionally do all those years and never really was very good. Because I really realized what goes in. I have a brother who's just brilliant, just came back from a concert series in Germany, and just, I listened to this, it's just so amazing. And it's humbling in two ways. One way is just this musical skill and this compositional skill, but the other thing is this was an orchestra full of all sorts of standard and unusual instruments, and just the beautiful timbres that come out of that. As an electronic, we think synthesizers are so much better than acoustic instruments because they can make so many different sounds. And yes, you can make it sound like a cow or like a helicopter, but when it really comes down to it, there's things like, well, I could listen to any one of those instruments for hours and still want to hear more. Now, can you think of a single synthesizer patch that you could play for hours and still want to hear more? Probably not. I don't think there is one. So I think in many ways, synthesizers keeps you humble. When you keep listening, people are fooling themselves, and synthesizers really haven't reached what acoustic can do. But it's really fun to go there and try to get in on that world more.
Professor, even though you're working in the world of synthesizers, there is some work you're doing for the blind people and the people with disabilities. How your techniques and your innovation is going to help. You started some humble work. Could you please share some of your...
Oh, yeah. I mean, actually with Braille music and such, long ago when I was a little kid, my mom spent a lot of time copying music from my brother, who's a very good composer, my younger brother. And, I saw that. And so then when I learned about computers, I tried to make a music printing program. And that went on for years and years and years. And yes, eventually I had this music printing program, which was pretty good. But music printing is, in itself, a very challenging thing, as sheet music. And so eventually through that, though, I came in contact with Bill McCann and with various unsighted people, blind people out, trying to print Braille, because their idea was, well, if you have a young, say you have a promising young violinist, and you're a grade school teacher, and you were to tell, this young girl is really good, and you were to tell her, don't bother learning to read music, just play by ear. Well, you'd be fired. Forget it. But that's the standard answer if the girl's blind. Just forget. And anyway, so to try to rectify that some and to have more Braille music, they thought, well, if music is being prepared on computers anyway for sighted people, why not also make it possible to do use the same tools and such to do it for unsighted people, for blind musicians. And so that's gone well, and it got a lot of attention. In the last years, though, James Aitken and various other people around the world have sort of taken that over because I just had too much. It's just got to be, it's a huge amount of work to do anything, and even with all the good help I have and such, it's still a huge amount of work. So to keep my sanity and keep my family life in order and such, others stepped up, and I'm very, very happy with that. It's nice to made that contribution and not have it just wilt, but it's still very much in use. And Braille music is funny. Bill McCann, the main blind person I worked for there, is a trumpet player. And of course, when you're playing trumpet, you can't read Braille at the same time anyway. But still, just for for studying scores, for all sorts of things, Braille is great. And I do think, because of copy protection, because of various other things, I think people need to stay aware that blind people have a lot of challenges and are in our rush to try to protect ourselves from people stealing something and all these other things. Got to be really careful that we keep supporting that community with new technology.
Professor, you have a full-time job at University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign. At the same time, you're really an entrepreneur, and your home is your lab and garage and your factory. And how do you balance personal life, family life at home, and work? And
well, one thing is to give up on some things. So, for instance, for the Braille music, even though many years invested in that and such, I just decided, look, I can't do everything. And also, it turned out people came up. This James Aitken guy is a very nice guy. He was I think a lawyer in Britain or something. He decided he would retire and do this, or at least that's my understanding. Anyway, it's great. So then, at the university, long ago, actually, we had student projects and stuff to build the synthesizers. And at some point, the university just decided it's too expensive. For them to build synthesizers and sell it, they got nervous about that. So they said, okay, you got to do this at home if you're going to do this. So my hobby has been at home since then. I had the help of my father-in-law, which was nice, because the job is a full-time job. Right now it's still summer vacation, but next week the job becomes much more demanding, and it's a challenge to do all the things, and it is frustrating sometimes. Like this year, Continuum orders have doubled, and we're just struggling to even keep up with the orders, even though it's so expensive and such. It's been a challenge. And so it works pretty well, but part of it is that a normal entrepreneur, they lay everything on the line. They don't have a salary from the universities, right? So for me, it's frustrating if I can't deliver something as soon as it's ordered. On the other hand, my family, my livelihood keeps going, and I fully understand that, yes, for somebody where this is their only income and they've thrown everything into it, it's a different challenge. And that's one of the nice things about working at a university, is that it is possible to do these things that maybe aren't immediately economically viable, but in the long run are useful things to do.
So how about globalization of Haken audio?
This is world headquarters. You see it?
That's right.